Hier ist die neue Folge der Ökonomie-Videos.
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most, let's say, debated ideas in economics right now, modern monetary theory, or MMT. You hear the supporters say it's the key to funding all of society's biggest goals. But what about the other side? What do the critics say? That's what we're going to do today. We're going to put this theory through a kind of intellectual stress test and really look at the strongest arguments against it. So, the core idea of MMT, right, is that a government that issues its own currency can't really go broke, at least not in that currency. And if that's true, well, that opens the door to funding some absolutely huge projects. We're talking everything from green infrastructure to federal job guarantees. It sounds pretty revolutionary, doesn't it? But here's the big question the critics are asking. Is this a solid blueprint for the economy, or is it a recipe for a whole host of new unintended problems? That's really what we have to dig into. Okay, so to get our heads around this, we're going to follow a pretty clear path. First, we'll look at why MMT gets people so fired up. Then we'll get into the classic concerns about state planning and the economic ripple effects. After that, we'll zero in on the criticisms that are aimed squarely at MMT itself. And finally, we'll take a look at what history might be able to teach us here. So why is this such a big deal? I mean, MMT isn't just some tiny tweak to economic policy. It's a pretty radical rethinking of how government spending and debt work. And look, anytime a theory comes along that wants to basically tear up the old rulebook and give the government these incredibly powerful new tools, well, you can bet it's going to face some serious, intense debate. And here's one of the first things critics will tell you. A lot of these arguments, they're not exactly brand new. They see MMT as kind of the latest chapter in a long story of what's called demand-side economics. You know, the idea that you can boost the economy by just putting more spending money into people's pockets. But they'll warn, if MMT is built on that same foundation, then it might just have the same old cracks and weaknesses.
And that leads us right into the first major bucket of criticism, the real-world practical problems of government-led investment. I mean, MMT gives the government the power to fund massive projects, but the critics ask a really fundamental question here. What happens when it's politicians and not the market who are in charge of picking the economic winners and losers?
So critics, they paint this pretty cautious picture of how these big public projects can go wrong. It always starts with a good idea, a real need. But then politics gets involved, right? You get endless debates that cause delays. Budgets get stretched and changed. And all of this leads to two giant risks. First, misallocation, that's just a fancy word for investing in the wrong stuff. And second, something called Klientelpolitik, which is a great German word for when projects get funded based on political favors, not what's actually best for everyone. And this idea of misallocation, this historical example, just nails it. Okay, imagine for a second you're the British government. It's the early 1800s, and you are pouring a ton of money into building this amazing cutting-edge canal system. It seems like a slam dunk, a sure bet. But then, out of nowhere, somebody invents the railway. And just like that, your massive, expensive canal network is, well, it's pretty much obsolete. That's the exact danger critics are talking about when the government tries to make these huge, long-term bets on which technology is going to win.
And hey, this isn't just ancient history either. Just look at the Berlin-Brandenburg Airport. It was supposed to be this incredible showpiece for modern Germany. Instead, it became a running joke, a symbol of total government dysfunction. It was bogged down by political fights, it opened years and years late, and it was billions over budget. For critics, this is a poster child for just how difficult it can be for the government to actually pull off these grand plans.
Okay, so beyond the problems with specific projects, critics start to worry about the ripple effects, the consequences for the rest of the economy. They argue that these MMT-style policies could set off some really serious unintended chain reactions for private companies and for regular people. One of the big critiques here is called the Strohfeuer effect. It's a German term that literally means straw fire, a flash in the pan. The fear is that all this government spending just creates this quick, bright burst of consumer activity. But then it just fizzles out. Why? Because the actual economy, the part that makes new and better stuff, hasn't really changed. And as a big cautionary tale, critics will often point to Japan. They've used huge government stimulus for decades, but they've still struggled to get that dynamic, long-term growth.
And this connects directly to how MMT says it'll handle inflation, which is by raising taxes. But critics see a huge problem with this. They're worried about creating this really volatile stop-and-go economy. It's like the government is flooring the gas pedal with spending and then slamming on the brakes with tax hikes. Now, if you're a private business trying to plan for the next 5 or 10 years, that kind of uncertainty, it can be absolutely paralyzing. Then there's another major concern, something economists call the crowding out effect. So a big part of many MMT plans is a federal job guarantee. Sounds good, right? But critics ask, what happens if those government jobs pay more than, say, entry-level or lower-wage jobs in the private sector? Well, you could see a lot of workers leave private companies to go work for the government. This could crowd out private businesses, hurting them because they just can't compete for workers on salary.
All right, now let's really narrow our focus. Let's get to the critiques that are aimed right at the heart of MMT's most unique ideas. Specifically, its take on the power of the government and, crucially, how it says it would control inflation. So, a really central criticism is about the sheer amount of power MMT would give to the state. I mean, if the government can just create money to fund whatever it wants, does its influence become too big? The fear is that this creates a public that becomes totally reliant on the government, a government that, let's be honest, can't guarantee progress all by itself. As a kind of extreme warning, critics will point to the state-run economies of the 20th century, arguing that when the state has total control, it can end up crushing innovation and prosperity.
Okay, and that brings us to what is maybe the most critical piece of the whole MMT puzzle, controlling inflation. So according to the theory, it works like this. If all that government spending makes the economy overheat and prices start to spike, the solution is simple on paper. You raise taxes. That pulls money out of the economy, cools down demand, and gets inflation back in its box. In theory, it's a very neat and tidy solution.
But in the real world, critics ask, how on earth would that actually work? They argue it's next to impossible to get it right. For starters, how do you know the exact moment that dangerous inflation is really taking hold? Second, how do you even begin to calculate the precise amount of tax you need to raise? And third, how do you nail the timing? Because if you act too late, inflation could spiral out of control. But if you act too early, you could kill an economic recovery before it even starts. The critics basically say the gap between this neat theory and the messy real world is just massive. And for our last section, the critics really want us to look at the history books. They say, look, we have seen what can happen when governments try to pay their bills just by creating more money. And the results? Well, they often serve as some pretty powerful warnings. Probably the most famous example is the Weimar Republic in Germany. Back in 1923, the government decided to pay striking workers. And to do it, they just had the central bank print unbelievable amounts of money. Now, this policy didn't lead to prosperity. It triggered one of the most terrifying cases of hyperinflation in all of history. It completely destroyed the value of the currency and threw the entire society into chaos. For a more recent example, you can look at the former Eastern Bloc countries. These governments all issued their own currencies, just like MMT suggests. But over time, their own citizens just lost faith in that money. And what happened? You got this huge gap between the official exchange rate the government claimed and the real rate on the black market. People did everything they could to get their hands on stable foreign money, like dollars, and this created all sorts of shortages and economic chaos. It's a really powerful lesson. A government can print all the money it wants, but it can't print the public's trust in that money. And so, at the end of the day, that's where we land. The case against MMT, when you really get down to it, isn't just about economic models or inflation charts. It really boils down to a huge fundamental question about the proper role of government. It forces all of us to ask, where is that line? Where is the line between a government that provides for its people and a government that, by trying to do everything, overreaches and ends up creating even worse problems? And that is the core tension at the heart of this whole debate. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.